The next item of business is a statement by Hamza Yousaf on coronavirus justice sector response. And the Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of his statement, so there should be no interventions or interruptions. I call on Cabinet Secretary Hamza Yousaf.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Let me begin by expressing, first and foremost, my gratitude to justice agencies and frontline professionals across the country for the response to the COVID-19 outbreak. Scotland's justice system is responding well. Justice agencies face significant challenges in the context of COVID-19 in adapting how they work and maintaining, where at all possible, access to justice, in continuing to protect our communities, protecting vulnerable individuals and those, of course, in our care, while also ensuring compliance with essential public health advice and regulations. In these unprecedented times, administrations right across the UK and internationally are having to take very difficult decisions to boost and strengthen the justice response to help combat, curtail and control the spread of the virus. I will now set out briefly the Scottish Government's justice response. Police officers and staff are on the front line of our response to this public health crisis. I pay tribute to the crucial job they are doing in protecting the NHS and other services and in keeping us safe. The approach taken by Police Scotland when interacting with the public is very welcome. It makes sense to engage, to educate, to encourage, and then only as a last resort to use enforcement action where necessary. It is in line with our valued traditions of policing with consent of the public. Only a fraction of these interactions are leading to warnings or fines. Compliance with the regulations remain very high. I thank the people of Scotland for their common sense and recognition of our shared responsibility during this crisis. I welcome the Chief Constable's decision to invite John Scott QC to review Police Scotland's use of the new emergency powers. An independent review by a highly regarded expert in human rights is a welcome check and balance, complementing the ongoing role of the Inspectorate. We have heard a lot, quite rightly, of the need for the police, as with many of our key frontline workers, to have access to PPE. I take this issue very seriously. The level of PPE that police officers and police staff must use is, of course, first and foremost a matter for the Chief Constable of Police Scotland, given his statutory responsibility for health and safety of his officers and staff. PPE will not be needed for routine policing activities where there are no suspected or confirmed cases of COVID-19. However, if there is a requirement for police support at an incident of suspected or confirmed COVID-19, trained officers in full PPE will be asked to attend. Police Scotland's guidance on the use of PPE is proportionate and based on risk assessments in each circumstances, and very much follows the advice and guidance from Health Protection Scotland. Training for officers has now been increased across the country, with specific roles being prioritised. By Friday last week, around 5,000 frontline police officers have been trained in the use of PPE and had a mask fitted. Over 7,000 kits had been issued. The Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, who work closely with others and with other first responders across our communities, are also doing a fantastic job. With increased time at home, I urge the public to be mindful of fire safety in their homes and to follow SFRS guidance. During this time, we have all been asked to stay at home, but unfortunately for many people, home is not a safe haven. Those suffering domestic abuse, including coercive and controlling behaviours, can feel isolated, they can feel vulnerable, unheard and unseen. The support is available 24/7 on Scotland's domestic abuse helpline on 0800 027 1234. Childline is also available to support children and young people. Police Scotland's response to domestic abuse remains unchanged. Officers will continue to respond to reports and endeavour to prevent harm. The Lord Advocate confirmed that domestic abuse cases will continue to be prosecuted rigorously and fairly, and bail conditions and non-harassment orders are continuing to be enforced. We have developed a COVID-19 domestic abuse emergency response to maintain delivery of vital services. We have provided support to third sector organisations, including an additional 1.5 million provided to the Scottish Women's Aid and Rape Crisis Scotland. We've also increased the Victims Fund to £100,000 available through Victims Support Scotland to help meet immediate needs of victims. We relaunched Scotland's domestic abuse campaign that makes it clear if you're experiencing domestic abuse, help is available and you are not alone. The court's spotlight has recently shone on how criminal business is handled, but I recognise, of course, courts deal with an extensive range of civil business. Much of this is rightly regarded as essential, a wide range of family law cases, guardianship orders and commissary business, to give but 3 examples. Maintaining the safety of litigants, of the judiciary, of court staff and indeed the wider public must always be the absolute priority. The emergency legislation passed by this Parliament to facilitate court business has been of great assistance to the courts in progressing business safely. However, it is inevitable that many aspects of court business are disrupted. I'm grateful for the way in which the courts are engaging with the legal profession and others to identify and prioritise those areas of work that can continue. Difficult decisions have also had to be taken in the management of criminal business. This includes the decision by the Lord President and Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service, in light of the social distancing advice, to suspend all jury trials in the immediate term. Let me be clear, the Scottish Government is absolutely committed to the principle of trial by jury. Last week we published a discussion paper setting out a number of potential options and confirmed that judge-only trials are not the favoured option of this Government. I was very pleased a number of MSPs were able to join the first virtual roundtable to discuss the issues our system is facing and the best way forward. I hosted sectoral discussions with the legal sector, third sector, human rights organisations, amongst others. The Chief Executive of the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service and Crown Agent have shared latest data on what the numbers of cases we are facing that can't progress and the likely backlog. Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service estimate in our paper a potential backlog of 1,600 serious cases awaiting trial by August. We must not lose sight of the impact of backlogs and delays that will have on real people, including, of course, victims, vulnerable witnesses, and indeed those accused of crime held on remand. Turning now to options within the paper, based on discussions so far, we will focus on a number of the options, including the potential for smaller jurors, social distancing measures within existing court facilities, measures to enable faster progression of jury trials to address the backlog following easing of public health restrictions, and potentially adjusting the sentencing power of sheriff courts. I'm aware not everyone will be supportive of all of these options. Representatives from the third sector spoke powerfully about concerns of any options that still require juries, due to the possibility that in these times there may be greater likelihood of jurors falling ill or self-isolating, and of trials starting and not being able to proceed, causing extreme distress for victims. And I'm sure every member has also received the letter signed on behalf of the 4 largest victims' organisations expressing some of their concerns. So many challenges remain, but I am heartened by the progress to date. We will continue to work to seek to mitigate and reduce the potential backlog of cases. However, we need to be realistic that the impact on the courts will continue for a significant period, even after the current health restrictions begin to be lifted. I come to now the most significant aspect of my update today. The Prison Service has taken comprehensive action to ensure social distancing and public health advice is met within our prisons. Some of these measures set out in recent amendments to prison rules were necessary to ensure operational stability and preserve safety and well-being across prisons. Let me take this opportunity to thank prison officers and staff for the incredible job they have done to maintain safety and order in our prisons during these challenging times. I'd also like to thank the range of social workers, public sector staff and third sector groups that have continued to support people in prison and after their release. As of last night, there are currently 89 people in custody across 12 sites, isolated as per protocols, and are being monitored accordingly. The monitoring of conditions in our prisons continues to be very important. I can confirm Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Prisons will be implementing a remote monitoring framework shortly. Measures to mitigate the impact of social isolation for those in the care of the prison service have been introduced, such as in-cell support material developed by those in SPS care by psychologists and those experts in mental health wellbeing. The suspension of prison visits in place since the 24th of March will be being felt by prisoners and, of course, families alike. I announced on Friday our intention to provide mobile phones to those in custody in order to allow them to maintain vital family contact while putting in place robust restrictions to prevent misuse. There are currently still, of course, some security, technical and legal issues to be resolved before phones can be rolled out, but this is a priority for the SPS and indeed for government. We recently debated the Coronavirus Scotland Act 2020 and provisions on prisoner release secured unanimous support. Work continues with SPS and Justice Social Work to carefully assess prisoners to decide who can be permitted to spend the last section of their sentence on a tag on home detention curfew. The slowdown in court business has also reduced the numbers of people in prison. However, we cannot underestimate the challenges that our prisons face in protecting and managing the prison population in the context of COVID-19. There are still a significant number of prison staff who cannot be in work, either due to ill health, a requirement to isolate, or as a result of needing to take care of children or family members. Taken together with the changes to prison regimes, these factors make prison an especially challenging environment at present for prisoners, prison officers, NHS staff, and others who work in our prisons. We've also had recent confirmation of a further 3 weeks of lockdown, so we need to make arrangements now with a view to the continued running of prisons. These factors make prison an especially challenging environment at present for prisoners, prison officers, NHS staff, and others who work in our prisons. We've also had recent confirmation of a further 3 weeks of lockdown, so we need to make arrangements now with in order to allow them to maintain vital family contact while putting in place robust restrictions to prevent misuse. There are currently still, of course, some security, technical and legal issues to be resolved before phones can be rolled out, but this is a priority for the SPS and indeed for government. We recently debated the Coronavirus Scotland Act 2020 and provisions on prisoner release secured unanimous support. Work continues with SPS and Justice Social Work to carefully assess prisoners to decide who can be permitted to spend the and indeed for government. We recently debated the Coronavirus Scotland Act 2020 and provisions on prisoner release secured unanimous support. Work continues with SPS and Justice Social Work to carefully assess prisoners to decide who can be permitted to spend the last section of their sentence on a tag on home detention curfew. The slowdown in court business SPS and Justice Social Work to carefully assess prisoners to decide who can be permitted to spend the last section of their sentence on a tag on home detention curfew. The slowdown in court business has also reduced the numbers of people in prison. However, we cannot underestimate the challenges that our prisons face in protecting and managing the prison population in the context the last section of their sentence on a tag on home detention curfew. The slowdown in court business has also reduced the numbers of people in prison. However, we cannot underestimate the challenges that our prisons face in protecting and managing the prison population in the context of COVID-19. There are still a significant number of prison staff who cannot be. This has also reduced the numbers of people in prison. However, we cannot underestimate the challenges that our prisons face in protecting and managing the prison population in the context of COVID-19. There are still a significant number of prison staff who cannot be in work either due to ill health, a requirement to isolate, or as a result of needing to take care of the challenges that our prisons face in protecting and managing the prison population in the context of COVID-19. There are still a significant number of prison staff who cannot be in work either due to ill health, a requirement to isolate, or as a result of needing to take care of children or family members. Taken together with the changes to prison regimes in the context of COVID-19, there are still a significant number of prison staff who cannot be in work either due to ill health, a requirement to isolate, or as a result of needing to take care of children or family members. Taken together with the changes to prison regimes, these factors make prison an especially challenging environment at present for prisoners, prison officers, care of children or family members. Taken together with the changes to prison regimes, these factors make prison an especially challenging environment at present for prisoners, prison officers, NHS staff and others who work in our prisons. We've also had recent confirmation care of children or family members. Taken together with the changes to prison regimes, these factors make prison an especially challenging environment at present for prisoners, prison officers, NHS staff and others who work in our prisons. We've also had recent confirmation of a further 3 weeks of lockdown, so we need to make arrangements now with a view to the continued running of prisons over the following weeks. I can advise the Parliament today that after careful consideration, and in agreement with the views of the Chief Executive, but vitally also to maintaining this and safeguarding the health, safety and welfare of prisoners and those working in our prisons. This action will help give SPS sufficient capacity, including increased single cell occupancy, to continue to maintain a safe custodial environment. By the end of this month, we will lay regulations on this matter, and again, I'm more than happy to keep members updated.
Move to the open questions. I call Mark Ruskell to be followed by Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thanks. I've received reports that prisoners at Glenorchy are exercising together in groups of 25, that staff are not able to routinely wear PPE, and that there's no COVID testing of prisoners. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary whether he agrees with the WHO when they say that the global effort to tackle the spread of disease may fail without proper attention to infection measures within prisons? Does he believe that all prisoners and staff must be tested as part of a test, trace, isolate strategy? And will he clarify whether the UK coronavirus detention guidance also applies to Scotland?
Hamza Yousaf.
Because to Mark Ruskell, I'll look at the specifics that he raises in relation to Glenorchy, but of course prisons are challenging environments, and therefore the rules, the advice, the guidance around social distancing are being adhered to as best as possible. There are sufficient supplies of PPE. I speak to the Interim Chief Executive of SPS many times during the week, and this is a constant topic of conversation, and there are adequate supplies of PPE. We perhaps need to be careful about what we mean in relation to the routine wearing of PPE. The issuing of PPE to our prison officers and staff is very much aligned to the public health advice given by Health Protection Scotland and indeed others. The numbers that are self-isolating, a number of those, the vast majority of those are on HMP Adwell, and the vast majority of those individuals are isolating as a precautionary measure. So I don't think there are particular issues in terms of the rise or spread of the infection in Glenorchy, but I'm more than happy to look into that. In terms of staff being tested, we know that for some of the testing facilities that have been set up, that prison staff are being tested to return back to work, and that's why we've seen the absence rate across the prison service drop from 25% at its peak to just below 20% as it is today.
Alex Cole-Hamilton, followed by Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Making decisions like these in the context of this pandemic is an unenviable task. It's all the more difficult because of where we started. Scotland's prisons were in difficulty before COVID-19. We think as the party that emergency release is the right thing to do with the right protections in place. In England and Wales, the Ministry of Justice has begun temporarily releasing all pregnant prisoners and those in mother and baby units. How many people within the Scottish, can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, how many people within the Scottish prison estate are pregnant or there with their young children, and are there plans for their release with the support that they need?
Hamza Yousaf.
Can I endeavour to come back to Alex Cole-Hamilton? I do know the number, but I have to be very cautious and take some advice about whether I can say that publicly in terms of then identifying the individuals that may well be pregnant. So it's one of the first questions I asked when the pandemic broke out. What I would also say to Alex Cole-Hamilton is a very clear reassurance that if these individuals can be released, then they absolutely will be, and there may be powers under compassionate release as opposed to early emergency release that we may be able to deploy. What I would also say to Alex Cole-Hamilton, and this is the very difficult conversation to have, that depending on the individual circumstances before they went into prison, for some, releasing them back out into that environment.
Excuse me, Cabinet Secretary, it's difficult to hear if you're not speaking.
Sure. So to release those individuals back out into the circumstances that they were in before entering into prison actually could do harm to the unborn child and indeed to the mother, depending on the scenarios that the family scenarios and circumstances outside of prison. So I hope that makes sense, and I'm trying to speak in a way that I have to be a little bit careful about what I can say and can't say at this moment. But what I will do is I'll take some more advice in relation to what can be said in terms of pregnant prisoners, but be under no illusion whatsoever, and be absolutely assured by the fact that where we can compassionately release those who are pregnant, then the government will look to do that.
Can I warn the Chamber that we're not going to get through these questions at all unless we pick up the pace a bit here. Rona Mackay, followed by Gordon Lyndhurst.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government how the Crown Office is responding to the current situation and what impact the COVID outbreak is having on the prosecution of crime in Scotland.
Lord Advocate.
Over the last month, the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service distributed over 1,500 laptops to members of staff, enabling them to continue to work productively from home. I'd like to be clear with parliamentarians that the criminal justice system continues to protect individuals and communities. The police continue and will continue to respond to criminality and to report cases to the Crown. Where public or individual safety demands it, accused persons are reported from custody. They're appearing before 10 designated sheriff courts, in some cases by remote link from the police office. The Crown continues to mark cases for prosecution and will continue to process both its existing caseload and new cases so far as is possible. The fundamental constraint which we face is the limitation which the current circumstances place on the business which can be dealt with in court. A small number of summary cases where the accused is in custody are proceeding to trial, but all other summary cases are being adjourned. Solemn cases in which the accused pleads guilty are calling so that the plea can be tendered and the accused sentenced, but as members are aware, no jury trials can take place at this time. The Crown's focus is accordingly currently on resolving those cases which can resolve by way of a plea and on continuing to prepare cases, both its existing caseload and new cases, so far as possible, so that they are as ready as they can be when trials can again take place. The Crown will engage with the defence to that end, and I appreciate the constructive communication which the Crown has had with leaders of the legal profession in that regard. The Cabinet Secretary has rightly warned colleagues that the impact on the courts will continue for a significant period after the current health restrictions come to an end or begin to be lifted. And parliamentarians, I know, are clear about the scale and seriousness of the challenge which we will face, and as the Cabinet Secretary has observed, about the human impact of that backlog, both for accused persons and for victims of crime. A lot of work is being done across the criminal justice system, both to respond to the immediate challenges and to address, so far as we can, the mitigation of the challenges which we will continue to face as we live with COVID-19 and its consequences. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to add my own appreciation both to the staff of COPFS and to all others across the criminal justice system for their continuing work.
Gordon Lyndhurst, followed by Ruth Maguire.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary mentioned the option of social distancing within existing court facilities for jury trials during the pandemic in his statement. Can he update Parliament on the work which has doubtless been carried out over the past few weeks, and on the basis of which he will be able to advise, first of all, the specific steps which have been undertaken to enable this to be able to happen? Secondly, the number of trials it will enable to now proceed, and how many courts can be up and running on this basis before the end of the month?
Hamza Yousaf.
Maybe helpful in the conscious of time, Presiding Officer, to be able to write to Gordon Lyndhurst with some of that detail. Work is at a very early stage. What we've done so far is speak to the sector as well as have dialogue with a number of other stakeholders, reduced the 9 options we had in our paper down to around about 4 that we think we'll concentrate on. And then, of course, once we work through the pragmatic and practical realities of those, will we be able to give further detail on how many trials may be able to take place. But I'll ensure that Gordon Lyndhurst gets as much detail in terms of the work that has been done to this date, and I'll ensure, of course, if he has an interest in being kept up to date on these matters.
Ruth Maguire, followed by Claire Baker.
Presiding Officer, I welcome that mobile phones will be provided to those in custody, and I agree with the Justice Secretary that maintaining family contact is vital, but the news will be concerning to some people. Can I ask what safeguards will be put in place to ensure that perpetrators of violence against women, of domestic abuse or stalking are prevented from abusing, harassing or stalking their victims online or over the phone, please?
Hamza Yousaf.
This is a hugely important question from Ruth Maguire, and I thank her for it. Of course, at the moment, the phones that are used within prisons also have some level of restriction on them, but clearly on the mobile phone handsets that we will provide, and it is our intention to provide them, these are exactly the issues, the security restrictions that we need to work through. So, for example, prisoners will be asked for 3 numbers that they can input into that phone. It will be for the prison service to then verify that those numbers are not inappropriate numbers to be calling, and all of that is what takes a bit of time. So although I announced our intention to have mobile phones handed to prisoners and those in our care, it will take time to work through those security, operational, logistical and legal issues. And again, if the member wishes more information on that as the rollout begins, or even before then, I'm happy to provide that if she writes to me.
Claire Baker, followed by Fulton McGregor.
Thank you. Following a change to the guidelines in England, the lockdown rules for the police and the public in Scotland and England now differ. How will the Government and Police Scotland ensure that people are aware of the differences? How will people who follow English rules in Scotland be treated by the police? And how challenging is delivering the message to the public when there is divergence, which is a situation that might become more common?
Hamza Yousaf.
I'm more than happy to look at the specifics. I mean, again, of course, these matters on the operations are for the Chief Constable in terms of the law. Where there's any difficulty, where there is any confusion in the guidelines or indeed in the law, then I'm more than happy that myself, the Chief Constable, we speak in an aligned manner in order to ensure that there's no confusion that exists. I have to say, from speaking to the Chief Constable, as I do, again, almost on a daily basis, he remains very satisfied that there's very high levels of compliance with laws, with the guidelines here in Scotland. He hasn't specifically raised with me, neither I suspect his officers have then raised with him, the issue of particular confusion around guidelines. But if there are specific instances that Claire Baker is concerned about, I'm more than happy for her to get in touch with me, and I'm more than happy equally to raise those with the Chief Constable.
Fulton McGregor, followed by Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Shared Parenting Scotland have advised that there are thousands of children in Scotland whose parents don't live together but share parenting time with their children. Like many in here, I've received constituency queries about this. The guidance issued has been clear that travel between symptom-free homes is an exception to the overall travel restrictions because there are benefits to the continuity of the relationship. Does the Cabinet Secretary think that this message is widely understood, and can you offer encouragement and reassurance to parents who find themselves in this position? And can he also advise what actions may be available to a parent who is worried about domestic violence in this context, including coercive control, and worried perhaps about their child not being returned to their care for some time?
Hamza Yousaf.
Fulton McGregor, on the first part of his question, of course I'm very aware of that context. I'm a step-parent myself, and my stepdaughter travels between our own home and her father's home, as per the agreement that we have. Can I say to Fulton McGregor that there is an exception made to the rules for the circumstances that he described, that a child can travel between homes, and again making sure that the health guidance is followed, because we understand how important that family contact is. In the days that came after the lockdown measures were introduced, the Lord President helpfully also gave an update to guidance, again in these specific circumstances, and if Fulton McGregor wishes, I can send him details of that guidance from the Lord President in relation to court orders and so on and so forth that must be adhered to, but of course also understanding that these are exceptional circumstances where sometimes parental discretion will be important for maintaining the safety and well-being of children. In terms of the question on domestic abuse, as I referenced in my statement, we're very aware and concerned about the vulnerability, particularly for women and particularly for children in these times. I again say very clearly and unequivocally, regardless of how busy the police are, they have said they want those who are either threatened or indeed being abused in their homes to contact the police where appropriate. They are available 24/7. They will deal with domestic abuse with a zero-tolerance approach in the way that they have dealt with previously, and I commend the work the police are doing, but also importantly the organisations like Scottish Women's Aid, Rape Crisis Scotland and the many others who are working to support survivors and indeed victims of domestic abuse.
Maurice Corrie, followed by Angela Constance.
Deputy Presiding Officer, can the Cabinet Secretary explain why prisoners still with 3 months less to serve on their sentences are being released in Scotland, whilst in other parts of the United Kingdom the cut-off is 2 months?
Hamza Yousaf.
Well, the decision for the cut-off or the threshold date for the prisons in England and Wales is a matter for the UK government. That will be specific to the challenges perhaps that the UK government are facing compared to perhaps the challenges that we're facing. But if I was to just say to Maurice Corrie, the release scheme by the UK government would see up to around about 4,000 prisoners released. In terms of a population share, we are not far off that in terms of our, again, population share at about 400, 450, and that number will inevitably decrease once the Governor's veto and other such measures are put in place. So I take the decisions for the Scottish prison system. I believe these to be the right measures, the proportionate measures, and I'm pleased that broadly across the Chamber they also have support.
Angela Constance, followed by Daniel Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I have written to the Cabinet Secretary and to Her Majesty's Prison Addywell regarding reports from staff, my constituents, about the presence of COVID-19 and very specific worries about wider access to PPE for staff. Therefore, I'd be grateful if the Cabinet Secretary could outline how these concerns about access to PPE will be addressed, confirm that measures will be taken in line with the most up-to-date public health advice, with clarity about who should wear what and when. Thank you.
Hamza Yousaf.
Well, I'll ensure that Angela Constance gets a speedy response to her correspondence. But what I'll also do is, as already referenced, I speak to the Interim Chief of the Scottish Prison Service on a near daily basis. So I will raise this issue specifically with her. What I would say in terms of those that are concerned for their loved ones, be they working in HMP Addiewell or indeed in our care in HMP Addiewell, is that the large number self-isolating, the vast majority of them do not have symptoms, but they are self-isolating because of the specific tailored advice given by NHS at Lothian to that specific circumstance of HMP Addiewell. So while, of course, it will still be concerning for them, the vast majority self-isolating there is because of a precautionary measure. In terms of her question in relation to PPE, I will raise that matter as I tend to do regularly with the interim chief executive of the SPS. But again, I'm being told that there are sufficient supplies and that the guidance on PPE is very much aligned to advice by Health Protection Scotland.
Daniel Johnson, followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you. Surgical masks may have some role to play in helping prevent the spread of the virus, but do little to protect the wearer from acquiring it. So does the Cabinet Secretary agree with the Scottish Police Federation in calling for masks of no less than FFP3 standard to be issued to officers because surgical masks are simply inadequate? And if he does, when will FFP3 masks be available for all police officers performing public-facing roles?
Hamza Yousaf.
Forgive me, I may have this wrong, and I'm happy to be corrected, but I didn't think that the Scottish Police Federation were calling for every single officer to have FFP3 masks. But if I'm wrong in that, I will go back and look over what the Scottish Police Federation have said. They have highlighted some concerns around their interpretation of the effects of surgical masks. But I have to say I am wholly aligned with the Chief Constable's approach to this. I think the Chief Constable has always, as far as I have known him, always taken the health and well-being of his officers and his staff as his utmost priority, as well as the protection of the public at large. The guidance that Police Scotland have issued, the revised guidance, absolutely aligns with not just Health Protection Scotland, but indeed Health Protection England guidelines that are followed by the UK government as well. So the guidance that Police Scotland have issued is absolutely aligned to the health advice that is given to other public sector workers. In terms of FFP3 masks, Police Scotland have an adequate supply of those. I've mentioned in my statement the number of people that have already been trained in terms of that fitting of those masks. And I have to say I'm incredibly impressed at the rate at which that training has taken place by Police Scotland. So I'm very satisfied that the approach that Police Scotland have taken on PPE. The concerns raised by the Federation, I will look again to see if they are calling for FFP3 masks to be given to every single police officer, but I don't think that would be necessary in cases where there is no suspected or confirmed case of COVID-19.
Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary spoke in his statement regarding Police Scotland in terms of engaging, educating, encouraging and then using enforcement measures. Can the Cabinet Secretary provide a clarification on the issue of people leaving their home for non-essential travel, whilst at the weekend we saw queues of people at the reopened B&Q, as well as people still driving to parks to walk or run?
Hamza Yousaf.
Can I thank Stuart McMillan for that question? And we have been absolutely clear on the reasons why people can leave the house. And also, of course, we've been asking people when it comes to that once daily exercise, for which I know everybody enjoys, particularly in the weather that we have today, that should be done locally. There should be no need to drive to locations, and we know the dangers of doing so, that driving to scenic locations, of course, might be a popular thing to do, and therefore they become crowded, and therefore socially distancing during those walks, during that exercise, becomes very, very difficult to maintain. So therefore the advice, very strong advice, has been to walk or exercise locally as opposed to travelling in the car. In relation to the guidance, as I say, it's very specific, it's laid out. I think the advice is very, very clear, and the police will take a common sense approach, as the Chief Constable has often reiterated, and as in fact the numbers that have been fined or indeed other action has been taken are very, very low. That demonstrates that common sense approach, but be in no doubt whatsoever that enforcement action will remain an option for the police to take if necessary.
That concludes questions on coronavirus, the justice sector response. Apologies to both John Mason and Alison Johnson for being unable to take the questions, and we'll move on to the next item of business.